Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor to open the early afternoon session, Regional and Local History, a Comparative Discussion. I was asked to remind you that on 3:30 sharp, right after the end of this session, you will be able to choose between a guided tour of the educational spaces of the museum or a concert by POLIN choir. And the concert will take place here on this level. Without further ado, I would like to present the first speaker, Professor Anton Polonsky. Actually, one of the founding generation of the scholarship on Polish Jewish history, going back, I think, to time immemorial. Well, we were there together sometime. Yeah. And Professor Polonsky is Emeritus Professor of the Holocaust Studies at Brandeis University and the Chief Historian of the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And I guess I don't have to present to you all his publication and all his deed, just mentioning to you that he is the founder and the chief editor of the annual POLIN, after which this museum is named. Okay, Professor Polonsky.
Well, thank you very much, Israel. What I want to talk about today is the role of Galicia and its situation within the history and the role of Jews in Galicia in comparison with the situation elsewhere in the lands of Poland, Lithuania. And I'd like to start by pointing out something that's very obvious but needs to be underlined. The situation of Galicia, that is the Austrian partition, Galicia and Austrian Silesia, and Krakow too, which was only part of Galicia from 1846, was fundamentally different from the Prussian partition and from the Russian partitions. For Prussia, the lands which Frederick the Great and Frederick William II obtained from Poland were crucial to the creation of the Prussian state. Gdańsk, Torun, West Pomerania, these could not without these, the Prussian state could not be established. And to give them up meant essentially abandoning the Prussian historical mission. So these lands were central to the situation in Prussia, and this obviously determined the history of the Prussian partition. For Russia, too, the lands which the Russians obtained from Poland were crucial to Russian national existence. Russia in the 18th century oscillated between establishing a protectorate over the whole of the Polish lands and over partition. It embarked on partition primarily because of the problems involved in expansion against the Ottoman Empire, and it obtained a large amount of Polish land, and in the 1815 settlement it obtained even more Polish land, including the semi-autonomous Kingdom of Poland. It could not give these territories up. Indeed, for Russia, the problem was it could neither swallow the Polish lands nor reach a satisfactory accommodation for them. The situation was quite different for Austria. As is well known, Maria Theresa was against the first partition of Poland. She took Galicia only because under the ways in which the balance of powers worked in those days, you needed to be compensated if other powers expanded. It's true that Joseph II, her son, was eager for this expansion. And indeed, Joseph II, who reigned from 1780 to 1790, was the only Austrian ruler who intervened actively in Galicia, both generally to undermine the position of the Polish nobility, to strengthen the Austrian bureaucracy, to strengthen the position of the towns, and to foster Jewish emancipation, and also, interestingly, to foster the position of the Greek Catholic Church. None of his successors did this, and indeed, after 1815, Austria was a power in decline. In the history of international relations put together by Derek Mackay and Hamish Scott, they write, Austria thus remained after 1815, as she had been from the 17th century, a state with the responsibilities of a great power, but without the means to be one. And in this situation, Galicia remained a marginal element in Galician politics. It was marginal to the Austrian economy. It had few natural resources, apart from salt, which was an important commodity in the 18th century, and petroleum, which developed as an extractive industry in the late 19th century, it was essentially a colonial territory which absorbed Austrian goods and which did not actually profit economically significantly from Austrian rule. This is why it was characterized by what was known in Polish as nędza galicka, Galician misery. Famine, starvation, was a feature of Galicia in the 19th century, and as a result, it was a territory from which people emigrated in very considerable numbers: Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews. Thirdly, although Joseph II had intervened actively in the organization and politics of Galicia, none of his successors continued this policy. This was true of Leopold, his successor, who was trying to deal with the disruptive effects of Joseph's policies, the revolts which they had provoked above all in Hungary and in the Austrian Netherlands, and Leopold died quite quickly in 1792, and of his successors, Francis and Franz Joseph. As a result, unlike the situation in Prussian Poland or in Russian Poland, no significant attempt was made to undermine the dominant position of the Polish Szlachta in Galicia. This may sound counterintuitive, because one could immediately say, well, what about 1846? You'll remember that Wielopolski attacked Metternich as a crowned Jacobin, because in 1846, when the Polish uprising in Galicia began, he allegedly incited the peasants against the nobles, and 900 nobles were actually murdered. What is clear from today's research is this was, unfortunately, a spontaneous reaction, a result of the class divisions which Professor Mach talked about yesterday in the Galician villages, and that although the Austrians did not significantly punish those who participated in this, they did not either like it particularly, and Jakub Scheller, the key figure in this process, was very quickly exiled. The same is true in 1848. To a small extent, the Austrian government did encourage the development of the Ukrainian national movement, but essentially it kept the Ukrainian national movement under control and allowed the Polish nobility to retain its position, although the robot, the compulsory labor tribute, was abolished by Stadion in early 1848. As a result, the dominant position of the Polish nobility remained in Galicia, and it was because of this, in the political crisis which Austria experienced after the defeat by Prussia in the War of 1866, that the Austrian government could concede very far-reaching autonomy to the Polish nobility in 1868. This was the only area of Poland in the 19th century which enjoyed this sort of autonomy. It is true that with the introduction of this autonomy, or that the dominance of the Polish noble class came under pressure in the late 19th century from the developing peasant movement. The word peasant sounds a little odd in English. I'm not sure what one can find in its place. The movement of small landowners, in particularly Western Galicia in the late 19th century, and also from the development of a more mature form of Ukrainian nationalism when Ukrainians worked within the political framework and constitutional framework of the Habsburg monarchy, and which is identified above all with the Ukrainian National Democratic Organization, UNDO. And certainly these new forces did play some role in Galician politics after first the extension of franchise to the Fifth Curia in 1897, and then in 1907 with the establishment of universal male suffrage in elections to the Austrian parliament. This raised the question of what should be done about the local Galician parliament, which was notorious both for its corruption and for the way in which the Polish nobility controlled the electoral system, as was the case in 18th century England, in order to ensure its control of the political system. And here there was a conflict between 1907 and 1914, between those who wished to hold firm to the old form of Polish political dominance, and those like the Galician governor, Michał Bobrzyński, who believed that this could no longer be maintained and wished to reach some compromise with the Ukrainian population, who formed the majority in East Galicia. And indeed, the result of this conflict, which is well described by Józef Bushko, a late and rather lamented figure, one of the great historians of Galicia, led to a compromise in early 1913, which the outbreak of war prevented from ever actually coming into existence, like the famous Moravian Compromise, which was supposed to solve relations between Czechs and Germans in Bohemia and Moravia. So this was the general situation in Galicia in the 19th century. Polish noble hegemony remained unchallenged even as late as 1914, although it had come under a significant pressure. So where does this put the situation of the Jews in Galicia? Well, firstly, there were a number of specific features to the process of Jewish integration in Galicia. In the first place, the German element in Galicia was much weaker than in either Prussian Poland or in the Czech lands, and most Germans in the province, including those who were brought up as Habsburg's officials, were rapidly Polonized. And this, along with the gradual decline of German hegemony in Austria as a whole, meant that although there was some support initially among the Austrian authorities and sections of the Jewish leadership for the transformation of the Jews here into Germans or possibly Austrians of the Jewish faith, ultimately the Jewish integrationists came to favor a Polish orientation. Secondly, unlike the Grand Duchy of Poznań, Galicia was a stronghold of Hasidism. And so the Jewish reformers here found themselves in a bitter conflict with Hasidim as well as with the other Orthodox opponents of the transformation of the Jews. And indeed, the Austrian government, certainly apart from the period of Joseph II, never intervened actively to support the Maskilim or the Jewish integrationists against the Hasidim. Finally, the mixed ethnic character of the region, with Poles dominant in the western part, but a minority in the largely Ukrainian eastern area, had a difficult impact on the situation of the Jews. How should one react to the fact that the Ukrainians were increasingly politically active? As I've said, it was only under Joseph II that policies of Jewish integration were actively pursued. But the result of these government policies were to transform the Jews into useful and productive citizens of the Habsburg Empire, was indeed to greatly exacerbate divisions between the more modernized and integrated elite and the large Hasidic majority. As a result, and with the establishment of Galician autonomy and with the establishment of constitutional government in Austria, integration was finally established in Galicia. Equal rights were granted to the Jews after considerable debate, both in Austria as a whole and in Galicia in November 1868. And this development led, after a certain number of hiccups, a period when among the Jews the German integration seemed to be dominant, and a period in which the Jews thought that they might have to make common cause with the Ukrainians. The Jewish elite, which had the support by now of the Hasidic majority, who saw them as the protection against intervention by the state, now established a long-standing alliance with the Polish aristocratic elite governing the province. Jews supported the Polish club in the Polish parliament, and this remained the case down to 1914. There were some challenges to the dominance of the Polish, of the alliance between the Jewish integrationist elite and the Polish ruling class in the province. There were those who supported the new Jewish politics. In Galicia, this meant above all Zionism rather than socialism. And there was also some call for liberals, like the Club of the Progressive Jews, headed by Adolf Gross, Jan Gross's grandfather, who was described as the greatest speaker in the Austrian parliament, to move towards a greater democratization of Austria. These divisions within the Jewish world came to a head at the same time as the argument about what changes should be introduced in the Galician Sejm and how far should the franchise be democratized after 1907. In the election of 1910, the Zionists came out as supporting the transformation of Austria into a state in which Jews would also have autonomy, and they won a significant amount of support. In this election, they won 3 seats in the Austrian Reichsrat, the first specifically Jewish party to exist in the Austrian parliament. But in 1911, Bobzinski attempted again to regain control of the province, and in the elections of 1911 he consolidated support for change and also won over the Orthodox by ending any demand that rabbis should be certified and have a university degree. And in these elections, which were characterized by considerable violence, Joshua Shaines has written about the violence in Drohobych, in which 20 Jews were killed. The old order triumphed. Bobzinski won these elections and retained the alliance with the Jewish club, and also introduced these further changes which would have given limited rights to the Ukrainians. How this would all have worked out had the war not broken out, and of course we know that the war was in an indirect result of the unresolved nature of Austrian national problems, without the alienation of the Orthodox Serbs in Bosnia, Princip would not have had the support which he had to assassinate the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914, but that's another story. But I would here underline the fact that throughout the 19th century, there was no large-scale transformation of the economic structure of Jewish life in Galicia, and this is why, to people from outside, the word Galicianer became something of a pejorative term. This was an area of largely poor and mostly Hasidic people. It was also an area where there was an elite, but this elite was composed of people with qualifications which were rather spurious, Galicianer, Doctorum, and so on. Nevertheless, for the Jews of the area, it was a comfortable situation, like pre-partition Poland, and they remembered with great nostalgia the days of Franz Josef, who they called Freum Jossel. Now, what is left, or what happened to this Galician heritage? Firstly, Galician liberalism, whether general or Jewish, was on a decline in interwar Poland. Czas, which had been a great organ of authority, was a minor political factor. And although Galicians were important in the Polish administration, Galician liberal politics of people like Michał Bobzinski had no impact on interwar Polish politics, something that one might regret. And the same was true of Jewish liberalism and Jewish integrationism. Adolf Gross, who lived until 1936, was a figure in Krakow. He had a major role in developing housing cooperatives, but outside Krakow, he was a figure of no significance. It was his brother, a socialist, who was a member of the Polish Senate. But the old dispute between the Zionists and the Galician integrationists was now resolved in favor of the Zionists. Throughout the interwar period, Galicia was a stronghold of Polish Zionism. This remained the case even after the local government elections of 1938, which saw the Bund becoming the dominant political force in towns like Warsaw, Łódź, Białystok, and Vilna. In those elections in Lviv, and Krakow, the Zionists remained the dominant force. But the Galician Zionists were a special group, a Kapitel für sich. They, unlike the Congress Kingdom Zionists, Yitzhak Grünbaum, who said Poland will only be a comfortable place for Jews when it is transformed from a national state into a state of national minorities, they believed one should negotiate with the Polish government. Leon Reich is the best example, and this tradition of compromise remained. Galicia also remained the one area in Poland where you had a significant minority of Polish speakers, and this, of course, also explains the importance of Polish Jewish writers from this area, of whom Julian Strykowski is probably the best known. Time prevents me saying much more about it. The Second World War ended the Galicia that we know. By the late 1930s, the moderate Ukrainian nationalist movement, the UNDO, had been replaced by much more extreme forms. The OUN, the Ukrainian military organization, later split and also became the UPA. The Second World War saw bitter ethnic conflict between Poles and Ukrainians throughout the whole of Western Ukraine. Jews were casualty both of this and of the Nazi exterminationist policies. The results were ethnic cleansing on both sides of the Sun River. On the west of the Sun River, there are only very small numbers of Ukrainians, and their situation is not entirely comfortable. The whole story of the Greek Catholic Church in Przemysl, which again I haven't got time to go into, is an example of this. And if you compare the situation in Vilnius with the situation in Lviv, Poles in Lviv are a much smaller group, much less significant, and there's much more resistance to their attempt to regain some of the churches which have been converted from Roman Catholic to Greek Catholic. There is considerable nostalgia, particularly in Krakow and maybe even in Lviv, for the lost harmony of Galicia. And I'm all in favor of this. Ben told us what a good thing nostalgia ultimately is. If this is a nostalgia for a harmony and for a world in which different national groups existed, at least side by side, at least in relative peace, I'm all in favor. But as I say, the history of Galicia in the 20th century is a tragic history, and it's a history of conflict not only between Poles and Jews and Ukrainians and Jews, but between all these groups. And its end result was ethnic cleansing on a scale difficult to find elsewhere, even in this rather tragic part of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As a born Galicianer, I have to remind you that this place was called by a German language Jewish writer, Halb-Asien, okay, which brings to one's mind the problematics of this area in many ways. Our second speaker is Professor Mordechai Moti Zalkin of Beersheba University, Ben-Gurion University in the Negev in Israel. His special fields of interest is the cultural and social history of Lithuanian Jewry until World War II. Among his publications are the Jewish Enlightenment in Russian Empire, Social Aspects, Modernization, Jewish Education in 19th Century Eastern Europe. He will be talking about Lithuania. Okay, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, I must admit, titled Polish Jewish History, was the ancient Jewish saying, Ma lekohen bebet hakvarot. What a priest is looking for in a cemetery. Or, in the present case, how can an historian of Lithuanian Jewry contribute to a discussion concerning Polish Jewish history? Well, I decided to accept the invitation because of two main reasons. First, one of the most important things I learned during my so many years in the academy, and mainly from my teachers like Professor Bartal, is never to refuse an invitation to attend a conference abroad. The second reason is, however, since Lithuania was annexed to Poland in some different ways, if I'm not wrong, also yesterday, one of the speakers described Lithuania as an eastern province of Poland, the chance to serve as a spokesperson for the Litvaks in the main stronghold of their beloved Polish brothers, Warsaw. Anyway, I want to thank the organizers for this unique opportunity. The historical research of Eastern European Jewry in modern times ranked across different axes. Some historians believe that we can explore the world of the Jews of Odessa and Riga, Warsaw and Minsk, Vilnius and Gomel through one prism, known as Jews of Eastern Europe. Against this background, there have been attempts to examine the different political realities as well as the different cultural worldviews in an inclusive way. For example, when it comes to the relationships between Jews and their non-Jewish environment, a unified picture was drawn depicting Jews' hatred by his anti-Semitic, potentially pogromchik neighbor as the main parameter defining these relationships. Historians of the second school make use of subdivisions that rely on political situations. This approach is reflected in a number of books and articles dealing with the history of the Jews in Poland, Lithuania, such as Moshe Rossman's article, To Be a Jewish Woman in Poland, Lithuania, Gershon Hundert's so famous book, Jews in Poland, Lithuania in the 18th century, and so on and so forth. This approach is quite common among historians interested in the history of major social ethnic groups in a given area and tend to annex local minority groups regardless the inherent variations characterizing these various groups. Historians of the third school define the demarcation lines of their research primarily according to geopolitical or cultural parameters. The books, The Broken Chain, Polish-Jewish Through the Ages, edited by Israel Bartal and the late Israel Gutman, Haskalah and Hasidism in the Kingdom of Poland by Marcin Wojcinski, and David Katz, Lithuanian Jewish Culture, are but a few examples of this approach. The fourth school, that focuses on local history, is well represented by works such as Jacob Satsky's very old book, History of the Jews in Warsaw, and Studies in the History of Jews in Krakow, edited by Elchanan Reiner. One of the major problems, primarily from the methodological point of view of the first two schools, is the built-in disregarding not only the unique cultural characteristics identifying various Jewish groups lived in areas under discussion, but especially the cultural, religious, and social self-perceptions of each of these subgroups. This approach, when the historian positions himself above the people under discussion, is not unknown in historical research. Thus, for instance, wrote Paul Brass in the introduction to his collection of essays, Riots and Pogroms. The power to define and interpret local incidents and violence, to place them in a specific context based on local knowledge, has been removed from the local societies in which they occurred. Ideologies of protest, from Marxism to contemporary feminism, and the simultaneous spread of systems of psychological, criminological, and sociological systems of knowledge have all produced authorities who claim to know better than the people themselves the reasons for acts of common or uncommon violence in everyday life. Events which occur in isolated villages and hamlets or on city streets have become subject to placement in categories and contexts previously not known to or incidental to the lives of those who experience them, end of quote. Largely, the historical research of Polish and Lithuanian Jewries might be considered as a variant of the above-mentioned theory. The fact that for several centuries these Jews were subject to the same political entity, as well as the relatively small number of Jews living in Lithuania in comparison to those living in the Kingdom of Poland, played a crucial role in their presentation as one unified entity. Only few historians adopted the assumption that, and I quote, the Jews of Lithuania were a distinct division among the Jews of Eastern Europe, and that, another quote, Poland and Lithuania were two different cultural environments, as Shaul Stamper pointed in his book on the Lithuanian yeshivas. How far from the unified school was the historical reality in these two regions, we learn mainly by observing contemporary Jews' collective self-perception, as well as their perception of the other. This observation reveals that for many Polish Jews of various social, religious, political, and economic strata, the ultimate other was not the non-Jew. The ultimate other was the Lithuanian Jew, the Litvak. From the other side, the Litvaks' perception of their own collective distinct identity was similar. This identity, which apparently had its roots in earlier times, formed and even intensified following the encounter with the other, that is, the Polish Jew. With the growing flow of immigration of Lithuanian Jews to the Polish territories during the second half of the 19th century, their sense of unique identity grew as well. This sense is reflected in contemporary popular discourse, as well as in the literary sphere. And I just mentioned a few examples. Isaac Meir Dix, Der Litvak in Volinen, Nachum Meir Sheikevich, Shemer, Der Litvak, Oder der Talmid Chochem, Moshe Hirschfeld, Der Litvak, Israel Katzowitz, Der Litwischer Jingel, as a response to Linetsky's Das Polische Jingel, and some other books. These are but few examples. One of the main motives in these books, as well as in many others, is the sense of otherness. Blatant manifestations of this sense of otherness are commonly found in the memoirs literature. Thus, for instance, in his memoir, My Shtetl, wrote Shlomo Zaltzman as follows, and I quote, most Polish Jews hated Lithuanian Jews, considered them as potential heretics, and the term Litvak was considered a pejorative. End of quote. Yechezkel Kotik, who was born in Kamenets-Litovsk, was even harsher, and I quote, "During my stay in Warsaw, I became aware of Polish Jews' hatred of the Litvaks, a hatred that usually characterized two hostile nations fighting each other. The abhorrence Polish Jews felt towards this poor piece of land known as Lithuania is inconceivable. Even though there were few Litvaks in Warsaw, Polish Jews hated them and found no better nickname for them as Litvak pigs." Now, he continues, "When Polish Jewish children saw a Litvak," and this is not my saying, this is his, they used to call him lechem in Hebrew, bread. Why lechem? Lechem, since it's the Yiddish acronym of Litvak, Chazer, and Mamzer. Litvak, Chazer, which is a pig, and Mamzer is a bastard. Not to mention some other flattering nicknames, such as Tselem Kop and so on and so forth. The main point is, however, that all the above-mentioned quotations testifies primarily to the centrality of the different collective self-perceptions of each of these Jewish subgroups. And at this point, I would like to highly recommend you to read the dissertation of our colleague, Dr. Maya Shabbat, sits here, in which she so convincingly discusses the unique self-perceptions of the Galicianers by the late 19th century and early 20th century. At a certain historical point, we notice, however, that the efforts made by Lithuanian Jews to portray their collective character, as well as to define themselves as a unique group, not only in regard to the virtual entity known as Eastern European Jewry, but within the entire world Jewry, was freed from the complicated relationships with their Polish brethren. Let me illustrate this trend by two texts, both written after the Holocaust. The first one is an essay, very well known to people in the field, written in the early 1950s by Avraham Kariv, titled "Lithuania, My Homeland," translated into English and Hebrew, and I quote, "A huge Jewish bloc extended across Eastern Europe, and Lithuania was an integral part of it. At the same time, Jewish Lithuania constituted a unique division within this entity, having its own interpretation of what Jewishness means," end of quote. This clear and unequivocal statement of independence, as I see it, is followed by an attempt to anchor this assumption in the unique nature of the Litvaks, characterized by being poor, modest, rational, erudite, diligent, self-controlled, and suppressed. A similar text, albeit of a different nature and much less known, composed by Yoram Teharlev, an Israeli poet, born to a family of Litvaks origin from the city of Kaunas. And I quote, "The Litvaks' restraint," wrote Teharlev, "is basically a generic and anthropological nature. They belong to a realistic and logical race of people who are all potential philosophers, the upper tenth of the Jewish intelligentsia. A race of people detached from Kabbalah, Messianism, and mysticism. They always rely upon the literary meaning of the text, logic, and even statistics, and never trust a miracle, luck, or a horoscope," and he ends it by "a gesunden Kopf." A gesunden Kopf is a healthy head. It's fascinating that Kariv, who was born in pre-World War I Lithuania, and Teharlev, that could be portrayed as a stereotype of the Israeli Tzabar, both share not only the same attitude regarding their own clan, but what is more significant, the same total commitment and uncontrolled drive to define the clear-cut characters of the Lithuanian Jews. Characters, not demarcation lines. It could be argued that the main motive for this compulsive need to emphasize the unique nature of this writer's tribe was the need to present an alternative narrative to the popular one, considering the Litvaks as one of the many subgroups composed this unique, magnificent entity, Polish Jewry. To my opinion, however, this is not the case. An attentive reading of these texts reveals that it is not anymore an attempt to defend the Litvaks from the ultimate hegemony of Polish Jewry. Polish Jewry simply is not there anymore. I'm sorry. No attempt to compare some positive or negative characters of both groups is made. Kariv and Tehalev, as representatives of the post-Holocaust Lithuanian Jewish discourse, turn their views inward, examining solely who are we. Undoubtedly, at the same time, they inevitably define the other. However, unlike their predecessors, they are not interested in this other, whoever he is. This tendency is also reflected in the most sensible issue, and I mean the memory of the Holocaust. For about 50 years, the Holocaust was almost totally identified with Polish Jewry or with Poland. Warsaw Ghetto, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek, Belzec, and Sobibor. And I must say that even the establishment of this museum, though its official name is the Museum of the History of Polish Jewry, even enhanced this tendency. The Holocaust in Lithuania, which resulted in the extermination of about 95% of local Jews during the years 1941, 1944, was pushed to the margins of the mainstream narrative. Ponar, the massive extermination site located nearby Vilnius, where about 70,000 Lithuanian Jews were murdered, was perceived by the Israeli public consciousness just as a song broadcasted in the Israeli radio in the day of the Holocaust. For various reasons, among them the modest, one may prefer the term submissive nature of the Litvaks, as well as their relatively small number, Holocaust survivors from Lithuania did not make any attempt to confront the dominant narrative. It was only by the beginning of the 1990s, after the collapse of the Iron Curtain, when Lithuania became accessible to Western Jewish visitors, accompanied by a thorough historical research, that Vilnius and countless ghettos, hundreds of murder sites scattered all over Lithuania, and the partisans' camp in Rudninki forest turned from abstract, largely forgotten terms into a concrete reality. At the first stage, this new reality had a very little impact on the Holocaust narrative, its presentation as a Polish phenomenon. However, some new projects, such as the semi-reconstruction of the Vilnius Great Synagogue, as well as the Museum for the History of the Shtetl in the Lithuanian town of Sheduva, both initiated by former Litvaks and their descendants, are clear evidence of a new era, an era marked by building a bridge over a half-century of subjugation to a dictated narrative, and introduce an alternative narrative anchored in the historical reality that has been wiped out in the troubled water of the Holocaust. Thank you.
The third speaker this afternoon is Professor Sam Kassow, of the Professor of History at Trinity College. He is the author and editor of several books, including the award-winning Who Will Write Our History, Emanuel Ringblum, and the Oinek Shabbos Archives, and is a member of the core exhibition academic team of the POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews. Professor Kassow, please.
I remember growing up in a Litvak home, and I was reminded that when a Polish Jew calls you at Salem Cup, you can respond, Das Milnit Kushinin Cup. And there are some other choice expressions, which I won't go into now. In 1935, in an article written for a massive Yiddish language almanac on Vilna, and by the way, I'm only talking about Vilna today because Professor Polonsky spoke about Galicia. In 1935, in an article written for a massive Yiddish language almanac on Vilna, one of many, as we shall see, Max Weinreich, the longtime director of the YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, tried to explain why the YIVO made his home in impoverished Vilna rather than in richer cities like New York or Berlin? The answer, Weinreich explained, was that Vilna had something other cities lacked: genius of place. Genius of place was where collective memory intersected with the built city, and also with a specific regional consciousness honed by a gorgeous natural setting. It was a regional consciousness that was simultaneously Jewish and yet aware that the Jerusalem of Lithuania was also Vilna, Vilnius, and Vilnia. Genius of place, Weinreich stressed, bridged the past and the present. In the city of the Vilna Gaon and the Schulhof, the synagogue court, Vilna Jews took nurture from the landmarks and legends of the past, even as they built a new Vilna on the more modern streets of the Pohulanka and the Vivulska. That bond between past and present earned Vilna its place, Weinreich explained, as a vanguard city in the Jewish world. Absent that consciousness of the past, in the neighboring Soviet Union, for instance, Yiddish culture would produce little of lasting value. 80 years later, as some scholars like Barbara Mann have noticed a certain, what she calls, spatial turn in Jewish studies, one might say that whether one agrees with Weinreich or not, this idea of space and urban memory, the Germans have words like Heimatgeschichte and Kulturraum, are certainly germane to an exploration of why Vilna engendered so many songs and poems, why it occupied such an outside role in the modern imagination of many East European Jews. And let me add on a personal note that as a child growing up in a survivor community in the United States, no one could match the intense pride of Nusach Vilna, the survivors organization in New York, or the songs that they sang, like Vilna Stadt von Geist und Mimes. Now, there are those who might say that Weinreich was deluding himself. After all, this was the same man who encouraged Lucy Davidovich in 1939 to stay on for a second year of graduate study at the YIVO, and who was happily making plans for the 1940 YIVO World Conference. Or that he was gilding the lily because he was writing in a book published in New York and aimed at raising badly needed funds for an impoverished community whose 55,000 Jews were just 1/6 of the number who lived in the Warsaw metropolis. And unlike Warsaw and Łódź, Vilna then had little industry. It could not even claim to be a center of the Yiddish press or the Yiddish theater. But before we accuse Weinreich of Litvak megalomania or excessive local boosterism, let's remember that he was hardly alone in his claims for Vilna's salience. Zalman Razin, the editor of Vilna's leading Yiddish daily, The Tog, called Vilna the mother city of Jewish public life, Gesellschaftlichkeit. The head of the Vilna Jewish Gehila, famed lawyer Yosef Chernichov, declared in 1937 that Vilna was the modern equivalent of Yavne, where Yochanan ben Zakkai had gone after the fall of the Second Temple to found the yeshiva and ensure the continuity of the Jewish people. Not infrequently, Vilna's virtues were defined by its differences with Warsaw. In Vilna, supposedly, there was more national pride, more self-respect. The social and cultural differences that made Warsaw Jewry a mosaic of different Jewish worlds, Polish speakers, Hasidim, migrant Litvaks, were tempered in Vilna with more social solidarity and cultural homogeneity. In a 1926 article in Literarische Blätter, the writer I.J. Singer made a strident defense of Vilna's virtues at Warsaw's expense. Both Vilna and Warsaw, Singer asserted, had spent a century under Russian rule. But Jewish Vilna had taken the best of what Russian culture had to offer: idealism, a determination to work for the good of the community. Jewish Warsaw, however, had taken the worst of Russia: Philistinism, Poshlust, an untranslatable Russian word, selfishness, materialism, corruption. Vilna, not Warsaw, Singer concluded, was the world center of Yiddish culture. In another issue of Literarische Blätter, published in 1938, Zalman Razin admitted that Galician Jews did have many virtues, but he could not forgive them the regrettable penchant of Galicianer intellectuals to favor Polish over Yiddish. Naturally, Many of those asserting Vilna's role as a lodestar and as a moral compass were supporters of various forms of diaspora nationalism, left-wing Yiddishism, or just plain Doigkeit. Doigkeit meaning here-ness in this land where we live. Doigkeit needed markers on the compass, points of inspiration, and Yiddish land certainly needed a capital, a role that Warsaw could never fulfill. But it was not only the secular Yiddishists that sang Vilna's praises between the wars. It was a Zionist leader, Dr. Yanke Vygotsky, who saw Vilna, with its Jewish pride and determination to fight for Jewish rights, as a moral model for all of Polish Jewry. And even those who recanted their previous infatuation with secular Doigkeit often damned with deep praise. One example was Zeli Kalmanovich, a Yivo leader who by the late 1930s had begun to question his lifetime dedication to secular Yiddishism and had begun to return to a Jewishness based on Torah and on Zionism. In his Vilna Ghetto diary, on July 19, 1942, Kalmanovich wrote, and I quote, "When God decided to destroy Jewish Vilna, perhaps he had a purpose, to hasten the redemption, warn those who could still be warned, tell them that there was no hope in the diaspora. Jewish Vilna was a model, an example for a Jewish community with its own unique culture in the diaspora. But many, too many, did not see the dangers that lurked in this culture. And now the temple of Golis Yiddishkeit, of diaspora Judaism, is ruined. Her temple is forever destroyed. One didn't need the present Churban, the present disaster, to predict the destruction of Vilna Jewry." This is in 1942. Now, Weinreich was just one of many who, between the wars, tried to instrumentalize Vilna's collective memory, the memory of the Vilna Gaon, of the Ger Tzedek, the righteous Gentile, the presence of the synagogue court and the Strashun library, in order to legitimize Doigkeit in Vilna as its uncrowned center. The well-known poem Vilna by Moshe Kulbach, published in the same volume that included Weinreich's essay, although written years before, also brought together images of old and new. Vilna was an amulet etched in Lithuania, each stone of her old streets a holy book, and Yiddish, plain raw Yiddish, was the oak leaf crown on the gates of the city. In this poem, Kulbach was at the same time affirming and contesting the past in order to build the new symbols of a modern Yiddish culture, symbols anchored in the city itself. The city engendered a process of constant contestation, an ongoing reconsideration of accepted cultural tropes. More than one commentator noted a capacious collective memory, large enough to embrace both the Vilna Gaon and Hirschke Leckert, the first martyr of the Bund, hanged in 1902. In the same 1935 collection that published Weinreich's article, the Yiddish literary critic Shmuel Niger recounted a popular story in Vilna about children who ran after the Vilna Gaon and yelled, "The Vilna Gaon, the Vilna Gaon." And the Gaon, allegedly turned to one of them and replied, "Vilna verstech seiner Gaon." If you only want it badly enough, Vilna, you can be a genius too. Vilna was a pun on the name Vilna. It appropriated the precious words of the Gaon to legitimize the image of a secular Vilna that connoted will, determination, and consistent effort. So da gehen etwas mit eigenem Seichel, as they used to say. And of course, I assume that the Gra was and is turning over in his grave. It was Vilna that bridged the dialectical tension between the image of Vilna as a Jewish cultural Mecca and its appalling poverty. A tension, by the way, noted by the late Shmuel Versis in his article about the image of Vilna in the writings of 19th century Maskilim. And as Dr. Tzemach Shabbat noted, it was Vilna's very poverty that made its cultural achievements even more heroic. Another striking example of this instrumentalization of Vilna's past in a very different context was Avram Sutzkever's 1943 symbolic poem, die bleine Platten von Roms Druckerei, the lead plates of the Rome press, where the fighters of the FPO, the United Partisan Organization, take the lead plates of the Rome press that had for generations printed the Vilna Shas, the Vilna Talmud, and they melted them into bullets. Here, Jewish Vilna in its dying moments is linked in a chain of memory that includes the temple, the Beis HaMikdash, and the Babylonian Talmud. And tellingly, one might read this poem in a different way, which is the Okay, let me find my page here. That one might read this poem in a different way. That is that the FPO in the Vilna ghetto had failed to gain the support of the ghetto population. They were leaving the ghetto for the forests. Jewish Vilna was doomed, but through poetry it would live on, not just as a memory, but as a link in a living chain of Jewish history. Weinreich's 1935 article was only a small part in a massive project of Jewish historiography about Vilna that began in 1915 and that would be cut short only by the Second World War. While important histories of Jewish Vilna had already appeared in the 19th century, and we have Kiryat Ne'emana and Ir Vilna, the subject of a stimulating article by Professor Zalkin, these post-1915 publications were different. They were, for the most part, collective enterprises. Just to list some of them serves as a reminder that Vilna was doing something that few other Jewish communities were attempting, to rethink the very idea of communal history, to write about itself in real time, to expand the scope of the traditional chronicle to encompass a new Jewish reality. And I have a long list of these chronicles, which I'm going to skip. Let me just say they ran to thousands of pages. One of the most important appeared in 1939. The first volume of what was going to be a 2-volume Landkenntnis, Kraisnavstva Guide to Vilna by Zalman Schick. And the first volume itself is significant. It's a guide a masterpiece of Landkenntnis that gives full attention to the place of Vilna in Polish, Lithuanian, and Belarusian culture, in stark contrast to the Polish tourist guides that sanded the Jewish presence. This new Jewish historiography in Vilna was a collective effort that brought together political rivals. Following in the footsteps of Dubnov, Ansky, and Peretz, these texts epitomized the political and cultural urgency of Zamling, of documenting Jewish life in all its variety, including a vast array of subjects, which went into a kind of a kolbo, a huge almanac whose implicit message was that the new Jewish world aborning in Vilna, the schools, the sports clubs, the libraries, were too diverse, too much a work in progress to fit into the Procrustean bed of narrow ideology. And that work in progress was turning into a civil society where political rivals could at the same time put aside their differences, even temporarily, and work together. And perhaps Vilna was the right size for this kind of civil society. Big enough to support dozens of key institutions and a professional intelligentsia, small enough to engender the relative social cohesion missing in a big metropolis like Warsaw. This Jewish civil society, with Yiddish as its public language, took root in the turbulent years of World War I and its aftermath. Those years saw a passing of the baton to new leaders. People like Dr. Tzemach Shabbat, Yankiv Vygotsky, Rabbi Yitzchak Rubinstein. These new leaders had all been tested in a crucible of war and violence, when by 1922 Vilna had changed hands 7 times. They had been there during the trauma of April 1919, which Poles celebrated as the city's Liberation Day, and Jews remembered as a bloody pogrom, which claimed 55 victims. In 1915, most of the old leaders, including the heads of the Tzedakah Gedolah and the great Talmudic sage Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, had fled the city with the retreating Russian army. And as Gershom Bacon writes about, in the Vilna Jews punished Grodzinski for what they believed was his decision to leave the city, and they elected Yitzhak Rubinstein instead in 1928. These new elites were seen to build a new city and to establish a new democratic community. They saw themselves as inheriting and combining the best traditions of Lithuanian Jewry with the populist ethos of the old Russian intelligentsia. Though they had been largely Russified before World War I, they understood that with the end of Russian rule, Litvak Jewry, and Vilna Jewry in particular, had to unite behind Yiddish as a public language of Jewish life and as a badge of Jewish honor. On this issue of Yiddish, Zionists and Folkists could agree, at least for Vilna. And all throughout the interwar period, visitors to Vilna from Krakow or Lvov would marvel that Jewish doctors and Jewish lawyers spoke Yiddish in public without a hint of embarrassment. I am not claiming that secular Doigkeit monopolized the writing of Vilna Jewish history, only that it was exceptionally productive in the interwar years. But there were other histories. Heiko Lunsky's work on the Old Jewish Quarter, Yitzhak Broidis's 1938 work on Zionism in Vilna, the English language history of Israel Cohen in 1943, which was savaged by Raphael Mahler in a review, and of course the monumental Hebrew language history of Yisrael Klausner, which for its sheer array of facts and information remains an indispensable resource. With Jewish Vilna largely destroyed, the writing of Vilna Jewish history now continued in new directions. One direction took up the tradition of the old Vilna chronicles in Yiddish secularist Vilna. Pride of place here belongs to Lazer Ron's stunning 3-volume picture history of Vilna, compiled in part to fight against what Ron called the panar of Jewish memory, the Soviet attempt to excise any memory of Jewish Vilna. Another example here includes Michal Astur's essay on interwar Vilna in Chesed Lavrom, where Astor makes the intriguing argument that interwar Jewish Vilna was a perfect case of what he called the practical or applied Haskalah. The other track of Vilna's Jewish history goes through the academy and professional scholarship. The special features of Jewish Vilna are reflected in certain differences between its academic historiography and the historiography of other cities and regions. Neither a metropolis nor a major manufacturing center, it lacks the kind of focused economic studies that Bina Gonsarsky-Kadri did for Jewish Warsaw, or that Philip Friedman and Wolf Jasny pioneered for Łódź. Unlike Krakow or Lvov, pre-1914 Vilna was not a Habsburg city where Jews could create the kind of political culture so well described in studies of Galician Jewry by Rachel Manikin and Joshua Shanes. By the same token, options for assimilation and acculturation took on a very different cast in Vilna. The rich literature on this subject, Agnieszka Jagodzinska, Helena Dotner, Ezra Mendelsohn, Katrin Stefan, Anna Landau-Chaika, is not matched for obvious reasons by corresponding works on Vilna. We have at long last a study of Polish-Jewish relations in interwar Vilna by Volkanovsky, a problematic study, but it does, as does Bakon's work on rabbinic politics, underscore the seminal importance of careful and detailed local history. Where the recent historiography of Vilna does excel is, no surprise, in intellectual history defined in the widest sense. Not just ideas and books, but also their social context. We may include here work on the Vilna Gaon by Manuel Etges, Eliyahu Stern, the specific social context of the Vilna Haskalah by Professor Zalkin, Cecile Kuznitz's and Kamil Kayak's work on the Yivo, Andrew Koss's dissertation on Vilna during World War I, Joanna Lissek's study of Jung Vilna. Another major development, building on the writings of Czesław Miłosz and Tomasz Venclova, has been the kind of thoughtful consideration of multi-ethnic Vilna, exemplified by Theodore Week's recent study, Vilnius Between the Nations. Let me add that until now, while one needed many, many languages to write the history of Jewish Vilna, one could, until the 1990s, maybe I'm wrong, largely get by without Lithuanian. But this will no longer be the case. The new Lithuanian historiography of Jewish Vilna, what Jurgita Verbiskene calls a new learned memory, will, I'm sure, produce important results in the future. One book on Vilna that, in my opinion, is of a special importance is Anna Lippart's Vilna, die Juden aus Vilnius nach dem Holocaust, eine transnationale Beziehungsgeschichte. Lippard approaches her subject as an anthropologist. What makes this book so interesting is its sheer sweep and Lippard's laser-like focus on memory and representation, the relations between Nusach Vilna and the United States, the survivors who were largely secularists and former Bundes, and Beit Vilna and Lochamei Getoot in Israel that had wanted to reproduce a very different image of the city. She also talks about the attempt to erase the traces of Jewish Vilna in Soviet times, and then what's happened since 1999, the attempts to recapture this memory by Vilna Jews, most of whom are not natives of Vilna, and by Lithuanians. Lippard mentions the famous song, Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg, composed by Hirschke Glick. This Vilna Ghetto song had an interesting odyssey. It spread quickly even during the war, and as Vilna Jews were deported to Stutthof and other concentration camps, it spread through all the concentration camps. And after the war, this song came to symbolize Jewish resistance to the Nazis. Many people mistakenly associated this song with the Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto. And as we know, there was no real battle in the Vilna Ghetto. In a book published here in Warsaw in the 1960s, the literary critic Shlomo Bellis wrote about this song, and I quote, "Is it not symbolic? Warsaw struggled and Vilna furnished the song. Is that not a reflection of the entire history of these two great Jewish centers? Warsaw earned its place in East European Jewish history because of its quantity as well as its quality. Because of its enormous Jewish population, she took the first place in the Jewish world. Vilna, on the other hand, was a cradle of ideas, a hotbed of collective creativity, an originator of movements which then went on to flourish elsewhere." There's a lot more I'd like to say, but I'll stop here. I just want to say that Bellis reminds us once again that in order to really understand East European Jewish history, we must pay special attention to regions and cities, and especially to the cities that played such an outsized role in the Jewish imagination. Thank you.
Schönen Dank. We have time for one or two questions or remarks. Please.
It's a quick question to Moti. You made a very strong case for the unity. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Good. You made a very strong case for the unity of the image of Lithuanian Jewry. I was wondering, how did the political disconnect between interwar Lithuania and Vilnius under Polish rule shape this image?
Well, the case of interwar Vilnius as a sort of a Polish city, if this is what you mean, Vilnius and the region, is a long story. I mean, I don't think that this unique case had a significant impact on what I was just saying. I can hardly think about a Vilna Jew or a Vilna Yid who considers himself as a Polish person. There were few, very few, even though, and you know, in the interwar period, as Professor Kassel said, there was in Vilnius about 55,000 Jews. But all of them, they spoke Litvish Yiddish, and they consider themselves as, most of them, as Litvaks. So this is my answer.
I have a question about maybe a hypothesis, because I thought about these differences that were mentioned between, let's say, Lemberg and Lviv and Vilnius, and as the two Jewish centers of that time, so different. And Professor Polanski mentioned that Bund, for example, was not an option in Galicia so much as it was on the north. And of course, maybe it was all because of the easiness of assimilation for the educated Jews. So, for example, PPSD was much more acceptive, probably, than similar options in Lithuania or Poland. So, my maybe hypothesis, or like the question of Vilnius, yes, as maybe it was basically the fact that there was so much of Jewish intelligentsia and Yiddish-speaking intelligentsia, and such a rich circle of center of Jewish intellectual life in Vilnius, was that those people in Lviv would probably become German speakers, Polish speakers, and would become much more easily associated with academia and so on in the let's say on the not on the Jewish street but on the main street. Yeah, it's a hypothesis, and it's near.
I have to start by saying I'm also a Litvak and my family come from around Vilna, but one of the features of Vilna, which you need to compare with the situation in Krakow or Lviv, and also to some extent even in Warsaw and I would say Łódź, is that relations between Jews and their neighbors were much better in Krakow and Lviv and in Łódź than they were in Vilna. There were a whole series of reasons for this. The fact that this was under the Tsarist Empire, the fact that the Jewish intelligentsia, like my family, were Russified, the fact that Poland was far away, the surrounding population wasn't Polish. But nevertheless, this is a fact which one has to take into account. If you look at, you're correct about the PPS. Just think of Hermann Liebermann or Hermann Diamant. These are prominent figures in the PPS. The PPS wasn't that strong in Galicia because Galicia was not an industrial region. I'm against chauvinism of all sorts, ethnic, regional, or even urban. I think all of these towns have features which are characteristic and which are very impressive. Krakow was a town where, for some reason, perhaps the dominance of the Polish nobility there, Jews and non-Jews lived side by side much more comfortably than anywhere else in Polish lands. In 1936, faced with the possibility of the Index winning the local election in Łódź, the German Social Democrats, the PPS and the Bund, fought together and they defeated the Index. You can't imagine this happening in Vilna. And there was an article in the Neue Volkszeitung then, Łódź bleibt Reut. And it was something to be proud of. So each of these cities has something which is important. Now, whether there is the statements which Motti quoted about Salem-Kopfen and so on, you can find similar quotations about Lancashire and Yorkshire. They're not to be taken wholly seriously. When it came down to it, we were all Jews here. I got the idea of writing my history of Jews in Poland and Russia when I went to Moscow for one of the Sefer conferences in 1955 and started talking to the people there. I realized very quickly they were doing just the same work we were doing here, and they were the same people as we were with a few differences. And so I think that one can exaggerate the differences, but what is interesting about the history of Jews in the Polish lands, or I should say also, just in parenthesis, I was always against the title History of the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. At least I think we should have called it History of Jews in Poland, which could then be defined however you like. Because obviously the problem in writing the history of this region, Jews in this region, is on the one hand there is a common culture of all the Jews who lived within the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. On the other hand, regional divisions within this area, between Poznań, Kraków, Lviv, Vilna, Warsaw, developed quite early. And how to describe these differences and the common features is difficult. What we have here is something unusual for a historian. We have laboratory conditions. You have more or less the same people subjected to very different policies, and very different results naturally recur from this. I could say more, but I'll hand over to Sam.
I just want to make two short points. In terms of Vilna, in an article in 1935, Dr. Shemach Shabbat said, if you had left Vilna before 1914 and had returned to the city, one of the real differences you would see, besides the fact that the city's poorer, is that you hear Yiddish spoken everywhere. Whereas before 1914, the Jewish intelligentsia spoke Russian. And one of the very, very important things that happened was that during World War I, there was really a conscious decision to relegate Russian to the privacy of the family and to adopt Yiddish as the public language. Yeah, but it was, for obvious reasons, Vilna Jews could not make Russian a language of public life in the 20s and 30s, and there was a very tense relationship with the Poles, exemplified by the April 19th, 1919 pogrom, where Aleph Weiter was murdered, and then the whole controversy about erecting his tombstone with the broken wing. And ironically, Aleph Weiter was warned to take shelter because the Polish legionnaires were coming, and he said an oppressed people would never think of killing other people. The second comment I'd like to make is that Nachman Meisel, the literary critic, in his memoirs of interwar Poland, said it was very difficult to get the Galicianers, the Jews from Congress Poland, and the Litvaks to come together into the schmelztop of Polish Jewry, into the melting pot of Polish Jewry. It was a painful process. They didn't really like each other. But little by little, a new entity reappeared that is just as, you might say, Warsaw brought together Poles from Galicia and Poznan and the far-flung regions and stitched together a Polish identity which was different in 1939 than it was in 1918. I think Warsaw played the same role for Jews in interwar Poland. That is, common concerns, the political parties, the TOS, the Joint, the newspapers, all of this meant that on some level, while you still had enormous regional differences, on some level there was this growing sense that we were Polish Jews, which is one reason why I think that the museum's name is okay.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon.